Good morning. Thanks everyone for joining. While folks are logging in, I just want to share a few housekeeping items as we get started. We will be recording this webinar today. And in addition, we've also activated the live transcript function for accessibility. So if you'd like to enable real-time closed captions, you can do that using a button at the bottom of your screen that says CC Live Transcript. We'll also have an opportunity for question and answer at the end of the presentation. So please feel free to use the Q&A function, and we'll get to as many questions as we can after our prepared remarks. So again, thank you all for joining this morning for the release of the latest report from the Ohio River Valley Institute titled Misplaced Faith: How Policymakers' Belief in Natural Gas is Driving Rural Pennsylvania into an Economic Dead End. My name is Joanne Kilgauer, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ohio River Valley Institute. I'm joined this morning by Ben Hunkler, our Communications Manager, Sean O'Leary, a senior researcher with the Ohio River Valley Institute and the primary author of this report, and Amanda Weinstein, associate professor of economics at the University of Akron, and the author of an important paper titled An Aggregate Approach to Estimating Quality of Life in Micropolitan Areas. Sean and Amanda, thank you so much for being here with us this morning. And Sean, I'll now hand the program over to you.
Well, great. Thank you so much, Joanne. And thank you all for being here today, because especially today in the immediate aftermath of the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act over the weekend, the passage of that bill means that we're right now at the outset of a period of time when we're going to be making some very, very profound choices about how energy transition is going to take place in this country. And because our region is so deeply involved in the energy economy, it has particular significance for us. And I think I realized how much importance it had for us just a few months ago. Back in April, the Allegheny Conference, as you may recall, released a report about a decarbonization pathway for Western Pennsylvania. And in that report, there were a couple of elements that were really, really striking. The goal that Allegheny Conference set out was to achieve a decarbonization pathway consistent with a 1.5 centigrade degree level of global warming. They weren't able to get there. And part of the reason they weren't able to get there is that the pathway that they outlined included a major expansion of natural gas, which seems somewhat paradoxical given that methane is now the single largest source of point source pollution, even more so than coal. And the inclusion of natural gas in a plan that did not achieve its full objective was explained by Stephanie Pashman, the executive director at Allegheny Conference, as resulting from the need, as she put it, to balance the imperatives for economic development on the one hand and warming on the other. And in making that point, she particularly emphasized the importance of rural counties and the importance of the natural gas economy to those counties. And that is really why we're here today. And so if I may, I'd like to share with you a little presentation that kind of summarizes, I think, some of the points that are contained in the report. Okay, there we are. I'm sorry. So rural Pennsylvania is a really fascinating and frankly, a pretty distressing place these days. We know that nationwide, rural counties are suffering And perhaps that's best measured by population loss. You can see in the little chart at the left, which we pirated from the Pew Charitable Foundation, a list of states, the top 10 states for population loss in rural counties among the last decade. And you'll notice that Pennsylvania is in the top 10 with states like Mississippi and Arkansas and Louisiana. Not a particularly encouraging set of companies or of partners in this. And it's important because population loss, while it isn't always thought of as an economic statistic, may arguably be one of the most important, because unlike a lot of statistics like gross domestic product or jobs or unemployment rates, all of which are very, very heavily influenced by episodic events and things that are largely out of our control, population change is something that's driven by people making very deeply considered judgments about where, not just where they want to live, but what places offer the opportunities to them and their family to fulfill their aspirations. And so when we see population loss taking place, it is almost always a pretty distressing sign. And that's why Ms. Pashman's comment about the importance of the natural gas economy was particularly resonant for us, because she's not alone in believing, and I'm sure her belief is sincere, that the natural gas economy is very important to the region and making real contributions. And when I say she's not alone in that belief, the image that you see now is the group of people and organizations that worked on the recently released Roosevelt Project, decarbonization pathway for Western Pennsylvania, in which they made the point that in rural areas, the natural gas economy has been a source of growth for local businesses and brought great investment to rural areas. And then finally, we see our elected leaders, and it's elected leaders from both parties. Certainly, Governor Wolf has made natural gas a primary engine for economic development, and that's a trend that's continuing with the advent of interest in developing the hydrogen hub, which we probably hear about more than we've heard about anything since the natural gas boom itself. And then, of course, a fellow who generally disagrees with Governor Wolf on almost everything, Senator Gene Yaw. This is the one subject upon which both the governor and the senator and most of the Republican legislature agree, that natural gas development is a significant part of economic development in rural areas. But Pennsylvania is interesting in this regard, because the assertion that natural gas is a contributor to economic growth, not just economic growth as measured by GDP, but to jobs and to other things that we really deeply care about, is in Pennsylvania a testable proposition. And that's because Pennsylvania has 30 counties that can be classified as rural, or very specifically, they're not part of any metropolitan areas. And in those 30 counties, 10 of them happen to have participated very, very heavily in the natural gas boom. And when I say heavily, what I mean by that is that today, in 10 of those counties, which in the chart that you see are highlighted in dark red, the natural gas economy makes up more than a third of their total GDP. Meanwhile, in the other counties that are in light red, the other rural counties, the natural gas industry makes up less than 4% of GDP. And so in that one respect, these two sets of counties are very, very different. But it wasn't always that way. If you look at the chart on the right, which measures GDP change from the year 2001 in both the natural gas counties and in the control counties, you'll see that up through the year 2008, they were on very much the same trajectory. They were growing at about the same rate as each other, and they were also growing at about the same rate as the state of Pennsylvania as a whole. And then something happened. The natural gas boom hit. And as you can see, GDP in the natural gas counties absolutely skyrocketed to the point that in the next 6 years or so, it had grown by more than 50% from what it was in 2008. Meanwhile, you see the state's economy, after a fairly brief decline associated with the financial crisis and the housing market implosion of 2008, going on a long but much more gradual climb. And then finally, you look at the non-gas counties, the control counties, that previously had looked a whole lot like the natural gas counties, and they really suffered by comparison, both to the state, but especially to those counties that received or that participated heavily in the natural gas boom. And it's that phenomenon that is what has driven Stephanie Pashman and all of those other people, including the politicians that I mentioned, to cite natural gas as being an important engine for economic growth and jobs and other benefits in rural areas. But there's a problem with that. And, you know, at Orvie, we've talked about this before. We've done a couple of reports on the impact of natural gas on the economy. And that is that there is a massive disconnect between growth in GDP and the economic benefits that occur on the ground in the counties. And so if you think back a moment ago, we were just looking at a chart that showed GDP change in natural gas counties skyrocketing while it was basically flat in the control counties. But what happened with these two critical measures of economic prosperity, population and jobs? And you'll remember that, again, going back to 2001, just as with GDP, the natural gas in the control counties were on very much the same trajectory. There's almost no distinction between them in population by 2008. But then after 2008, after we've experienced the natural gas boom, did we see an increase in population commensurate with the growth in GDP in the natural gas counties? And the answer is no, we did not. In fact, population has declined in the natural gas counties even faster than it has dropped in the control counties. And you'll notice that the rate of decline has increased over time in concert with the growth in natural gas activity. And we see almost the same story in jobs. Again, between 2001 and 2008, the test and the control counties were on pretty much the same trajectory. And then after 2008, you do see some lift, not immense, but you see some lift in jobs for the natural gas counties. But then you see something that's really critical. In the year 2012, whatever growth, whatever small growth there was in natural gas employment achieved its peak. And then starting in 2012, it went into decline. Now that's despite the fact that the industry itself was still growing markedly. And today, looking back to the year 2012, the rural natural gas counties in Pennsylvania have lost jobs every year since 2012. It's now a 9-year losing streak in Pennsylvania rural natural gas counties, to the point that as we look back to 2001, natural gas counties have had a net job loss of more than 8%, which isn't quite as deep as in the control counties, but 8% loss versus 9% loss. Clearly, we have not seen the kinds of economic benefits that I'm sure Ms. Pashman, the governor, Senator Yaw, and so many other policymakers are announcing. And so as we step back and we contemplate, what does this mean for Pennsylvania going forward? And what choices should we make about how we invest our money and the kind of decarbonization path that we choose? It's critical that state leaders and policymakers, also at the local level, county commissioners, mayors, that they recognize that the natural gas industry, while it is capable of generating some significant tax revenues through impact fees, it is not an engine. It's not a foundation or a platform for broad scale economic growth, at least in terms, it is in GDP, but not in terms of jobs and income, and most especially in population. Because one of the things that we know is that as the population of places decline, we're also seeing an erosion in the talent pool. One of the principal reasons that businesses move to communities is because they believe that they can find workers there. And we know that we're in a paradoxical situation, and I'm sure you've heard it, in which we're told that businesses in many counties can't find workers. And what we're witnessing with the population loss is one of those reasons. And I should point out that one of the last claims that is often made in defense of the natural gas industry, despite the fact that it has not generated job growth, despite the fact that it's not generated significant income growth, is that it has had a knock-on effect, a multiplier effect with respect to the rest of the economy. And again, what you see in the chart before you now is a comparison of GDP growth with the mining sector, which includes natural gas removed from it. And again, you see the comparison of the natural gas counties and the control counties. And what you see is that there's virtually no difference. And in fact, in the last year, the natural gas counties have even fallen behind the control counties in per capita GDP, excluding natural gas. In other words, not only has the natural gas industry not produced job growth, not only has it apparently contributed to population loss, it also has not had beneficial knock-on effects for the economy as a whole. And so, after Orvie came out with its first report on the kinds of failures we're talking about now in the natural gas economy, one of the claims that was made was, well, yes, even if the numbers are right, things would have been a lot worse without the natural gas boom. And what the comparison of these test and control counties shows us is that, well, actually, there's no evidence to support that assertion. And then finally, we can revisit another old question, which is, will continued expansion of natural gas and even of downstream industries like hydrogen and petrochemicals change the picture that we're looking at right now? And sadly, the answer is almost certainly not. And that's because the hydrogen petrochemical industries suffer from many of the same weaknesses of the natural gas economy. They're not very labor intensive. They have few downstream consequences, as we're witnessing, by the way, right now with the opening of the cracker plant in Beaver County, where we've seen no significant downstream development as a result of that. And so we need to bring these basic facts to the attention of policymakers, because the assertion, which we see made repeatedly, as we saw earlier in this presentation, that the natural gas boom is beneficial for Pennsylvania and particularly for rural counties, is sadly misguided. The good news, though, is there is another way. There are other opportunities for economic development, other strategies that can be embraced. And that is what Amanda Weinstein from the University of Akron, I think is here to share with us. So Amanda, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Sean. So a lot of what we heard in economic development is a lot when places are struggling, they look to an industry or a company to save them. See if I can, there we go. So what I wanted to look at with my co-authors here, Michael Hicks and Emily Warnell, was we wanted to look at this notion of can this industry, can business save these towns, especially when they're struggling, or is there another way forward? And what we often think about with this narrative that we hear is that there's going to be some kind of economic superhero, right? Whether it's natural gas or this hydrogen hub that Sean is talking about, can this one industry or this one company come in and save our struggling town? And sure enough, what we see with some of these struggling towns is there's an industry who will step up and say, yes, I'll save your town. So what you just heard from Sean happened also in Ohio, where we heard with hydraulic fracturing that it was going to be the biggest thing since the plow to hit Ohio. It was going to create billions of dollars and 200,000 jobs. So this was back in 2011 that they said this. So at the same time, my co-author Mark Partridge and I wanted to get a better estimate. Even when the boom is as big as it possibly can be. So we're looking, so what you saw with Sean's slides, right? You have that boom and then it starts to tailor off. We're looking at the peak of that boom, right? So at the peak of this boom, is it going to create 200,000 jobs? And we looked to Pennsylvania and we just saw, no, it's not going to be anywhere near 200,000 jobs. Even the highest estimate puts natural gas employment adding about 10,000 jobs in Pennsylvania at the peak, right? So even if there is this big multiplier effect, about 20,000, they're off by a magnitude of 10 here. It's going to be nowhere in the ballpark of 200,000 jobs, right? So then now we've come a little way since 2011, right? So now what we're seeing is we actually see reporters, and I give a lot of reporters credit for this, and the work at the Ohio River Valley Institute, looking back and saying, did we actually have this boom that was promised? And what we see is no, we really didn't have this big boom. And specifically, when you look at those counties within Ohio, just like Sean looked at those counties within Pennsylvania, you don't see that boom lasting. And you see a lot of those counties are actually worse off now after the boom, right? So then what is it, right? If it's not one industry, if it's not natural gas, it's going to come in and save these towns, what is it? And so here it is quality of life. So this is a quote I pulled from a recent Economist article that said, mayors are shifting their focus from attracting firms to attracting residents by improving quality of life, making these cities a nice place to live. And this is based on a host of research in economics that shows quality of life is increasingly important, most of it focusing on large cities. So what we wanted to look at is small towns, rural areas. Does the same thing apply to those rural areas? Right? So here, when we think about quality of life and making a place nice to live, so here I think about my real estate agent, right? The favorite 3 words of any real estate agent is location, 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 right? It is what about that location makes that house nice, makes that town nice, right? So what we want to look at is based on that location. Can we estimate quality of life for every county across the country? And so that's what we did. We get an estimate of quality of life. What is that location premium? The premium people are willing to pay to live in that location because it's simply a nice place to live. So here what you see are the blue counties are the places generally nicer place to live. And of course we see the coast pop out here. We see, the West and the mountains pop out. And one concerning thing we see in the Midwest and Appalachian area in Pennsylvania is you see some of those same drilling counties pop out as orange, as struggling here with quality of life, that they're not investing or doing things to make their place a nice place to live. So what we wanted to do is not just look at quality of life, but also compare it to quality of business, right? So maybe you didn't lean into the quality of life of this location and you really leaned into making it a great place to do business. So we get an estimate here of the quality of business, places that leaned in more to making it a really good business-friendly environment. And then what we wanted to do is compare these two in terms of population growth and job growth. Which one performs better? So what these two scatter plots are looking at are they're looking at our estimates of quality of life. So here we have scaled it down to the counties that are small counties, so those micropolitan areas. And we also scaled it for this slide, I scaled it back further to those Midwest small towns. So here, when we look at those small towns in the Midwest, and we look at if you have higher quality of life, on that first graph, you also have higher population growth. On the right, if you have higher estimated quality of life, you also have higher job growth. So we see that leaning into this quality of life, making a place nice to live, produces higher population growth and higher job growth. What about the quality of the business environment? We actually don't see that relationship. And in fact, in the Midwest, we see that if you leaned into making your place a higher quality of business, you actually see lower population growth and you see slightly lower on the job growth. Quality of life, more than the quality of the business environment, is associated with higher population growth and higher job growth. Right? So then the question is, so how do I make my place a nice place to live? And the first thing that popped out that we saw, right, natural amenities. So here, if you have, beaches, mountains, rivers, waters, those type of things, right, those natural amenities really matter to having a nice place to live. But we know we can't really build mountains and we can't build beaches, right? So what does that mean we can do is we can build on the amenities we do have. What unique natural amenities do we have that we can build off of? Do we have slopes that we can turn into ski slopes? Can we do hiking trails and biking trails? All of this recreation type stuff. Can you do, canoeing down a river? So these are the types of things that make places nicer to live, nicer places to be. So we also find arts and culture. So there you're thinking about what unique aspects of these towns are charming is kind of what I think about it, right? So you can think about could be little art store, it could be restaurants, all of these things, food stores, all of these things are kind of more on the private goods and services side are things that we can lean into just to make places nicer to live. And there's also public goods and services. So some of the things we find that are important for quality of life are things like having low crime rates, having better health outcomes, more connectivity, right? So that could be connectivity through broadband, through trails, connectivity that could be connecting to roads or larger cities. So when you want those big city amenities, it's easier to get to, but you can still live in those, charming little towns. And when we look at what has the largest impact, most consistent, strongest impact, when we look at quality of life, it was school spending. If you think about families, when they're thinking about where they want to live, the quality of those schools is really important, especially for families with kids. So here, when I think about what's really important for these towns, is I kind of think back to this business mindset. And I think about really your clients need to come first. First, there is no kind of economic superhero that is coming to save this town. No one industry can do this. It is harder work than that. It's a lot of different industries. Industry diversity matters. And especially what matters is for those industries and those businesses and those public services to be making sure their current clients are coming first, right? So that we're making these towns a nice place to live for the people that live there right now. And that needs to be first and foremost in the minds of businesses and the minds of our public policymakers.
Thank you so much, Amanda. It's really great to see your work and hear about what it could mean for the philosophy of economic development that our communities should be thinking about taking up moving forward. I know we do have some questions. Before we get to those, I just want to briefly mention one potential looming economic superhero that we're currently contending with in the Ohio Valley. And that is, Sean mentioned this and Amanda mentioned this, that is the hydrogen and carbon capture hub concept. So later this week, the Pennsylvania House Democratic Policy Committee will be holding a hearing in Pittsburgh on developing the hydrogen hubs, at which we'll be providing testimony on behalf of ORV. Now, this hearing is an opportunity for us to really present some of the challenges that we see with how policymakers are already approaching this concept, and that is as an economic superhero, as a potential, too good to be true, kind of both economic and climate savior for the region. But ultimately, we understand that the current proposals around a hydrogen hub for southwestern Pennsylvania and the Ohio Valley more broadly are based on finding new markets for shale gas and creating an incredibly significant build out of new carbon capture and sequestration infrastructure, which could include pipelines, injection wells, and all the kinds of infrastructure we're accustomed to seeing with other kinds of fossil fuel development. So in addition to this report that we're presenting today, Sean and others on our research team have been analyzing the environmental, economic, and financial landscape of the proposed hydrogen hub build out. And based on that analysis, we've identified 5 key issues that we wanted to share as we think about the findings from Sean's report and also from Amanda's paper and how they interact with one another. So things that we know about the proposed hydrogen hub are that the underlying economics are going to be costly and uncompetitive, similar to many of the things we saw with the failure of the petrochemical renaissance to materialize. We also see that the proposed hub currently lacks a concrete plan or a viable business model. So these are, currently we're looking at elected officials and other policymakers charting a course for the future of this region based on a plan that currently does not have a plan or a business model. Also, it's very likely that the entire cost of such development would be inflicted on taxpayers and ratepayers at a time when the energy burden is already really significant for residents of our communities. In addition, just the same way that this analysis looked at the oil and gas boom, a proposed hydrogen and carbon capture hub is unlikely to deliver the kind of growth in jobs and prosperity that's currently being attached to it. And finally, the resources and attention that are being devoted to this kind of activity could really delay a true clean energy transition in our region, as well as some of the economic diversification and other job development strategies that have seen success in other micropolitan areas. So I will pause there and just say, thanks again to Sean and Amanda for your presentations and to all of you for being here. We have 2 questions currently in the Q&A and then a couple of questions in the chat. So if I could begin, Sean, with a question from Kathy Ann Kowalski. Would you think that the implications for the analysis that you've done in Pennsylvania would also apply to Ohio, and why? And then the second part of that question is, when the Ohio Department of Natural Resources points to jobs, they claim that fracking horizontal drilling has added between 20 to 30,000 jobs, both direct and indirect, statewide. If those numbers are right, it's likely that a lot of those jobs may be outside of the counties where lots of the drilling is going on, especially the indirect jobs. Why might that be problematic?
Well, thanks for the question, Kathy. And the answer to the first part of your question about whether the findings in this report would be applicable to Ohio, unfortunately, is yes, they very much are. In fact, when we did our original report going back to February of 2021, in which we looked at population, income, and job changes, we saw that the 7 principal counties in Ohio for natural gas development, and those 7 counties, which are all generally in the Ohio Valley, in the eastern and southeastern part of the state, actually experienced more severe job and population losses than were experienced in Pennsylvania. And so while we don't have, because of the geographical concentration in Ohio, the kind of natural experiment that we had in Pennsylvania, it's almost certain that the same dynamics are at work there. To the second part of your question, having to do with the claim that fracking has added between 20 to 30,000 jobs, I think there are 2 points that need to be made in that regard. First of all, I don't know where those numbers come from, but let's go with them for a moment. The first point I would make relates to something that Amanda said a moment ago, and that is, you'll recall that once upon a time, going back to the year, I think it was 2011, the Kleinhens and Associates did a report for the Ohio Oil and Gas Association, which projected 200,000 jobs for Ohio from this kind of development. So if ODNR is saying 20 to 30,000 jobs, it means that basically the industry missed its goal by 85 to 90%. The second part of the answer, however, is, and I think this is perhaps the, well, less cheeky, but more telling one, is that the natural gas boom and all of the subsequent or imagined booms that were supposed to follow, whether with the Appalachian storage hub or the petrochemical cluster, or now with the hydrogen hub, all of these were sold as quote unquote economic game changers that were not just about what would happen within the industry, but what would happen in the economies as a whole. And so when we talk about adding 20 to 30,000 jobs, what that doesn't take into account, even assuming that those numbers are accurate, is how many other jobs have been lost. And Amanda rattled off a rather daunting array of the kinds of damage that are done when an industry comes in and has serious environmental and health consequences and other economic consequences. And so what at least the numbers that we're seeing suggests that while, yes, there were expansions in employment within the industry and in some narrow segments of the economy as a whole, that when you look across the entirety of the economy, and that's what was reflected in one of the last charts that I showed, when you look outside of the sector itself at the rest of the economy, there was no net growth. And there's frankly no indication the situation in Ohio is any better than the one in Pennsylvania, and at least some indications that it's even worse.
Thank you, Sean. Amanda, we had a question in the chat that I think might be relevant to your research, which is, did you look at, or do you have any thoughts about the salience of small towns and rural communities being more welcoming of greater racial diversity, immigrant populations, et cetera, with their economic outcomes?
So one thing we looked at in general is that the strategy for quality of life was good for reducing poverty rates. And so what that gets us is when we think about broad economic growth and economic prosperity, we think quality of life does a better job at kind of lifting all boats. So we have actually just started leaning into thinking more about immigration and how that interacts. So our very, very initial look at that is that immigration can be a big source of that population decline that Sean showed you. It can be a very important source for those communities when it comes to immigration. As far as being welcoming, a lot of the studies I've seen on being welcoming is that most people are generally pretty welcoming to their own community and the people in their own community. So when you're talking about racial diversity or immigrants in your town, most people are welcoming to the people in that town. And that is true of rural areas, just like it is urban areas. So even if they have political beliefs that might suggest otherwise, it's typically what other research shows is that their ideas of immigration come from thinking about another town, somewhere in the southern border, for example, somewhere where they don't live. So most rural towns are very welcoming to the immigrants who are in there. So there was a report, I think it was on Erie, Pennsylvania, that found, even though they had a lot of sentiments that were kind of anti-immigration, they were very positive and welcoming to the immigrants that were in their own community. And I think that is true of small towns and rural areas in general.
Thank you. Sean, the next question is, I'll give it to you to start off with. This is from Paul Goff. Could you talk about how this research might apply to counties that collar Pittsburgh, like Washington, Butler, Beaver, and Westmoreland counties, and whether they may be attached to the Pittsburgh metropolitan area, but significant portions also share a lot more in common with the rural areas? So for example, what has the impact been in Washington County?
I'm really glad you asked this one, Paul, because Washington County is almost a case in point. It's almost a microcosm of what is happening in Western Pennsylvania and the region as a whole. Because as you point out in your question, Washington County is contiguous to Allegheny County and to Pittsburgh. And the pattern, if you go back to the report that we did a year ago, which found that there was basically no job growth in the fracking counties in Appalachia, including 8 counties in Pennsylvania, one of which is Washington County. It's noteworthy that had it not been for Washington County, and I think the number was 8,000 jobs added there over the last decade, the performance of natural gas counties would have been a net job loss. And to understand why that is the case in Washington County, because among all the natural gas counties, it stands out as the outlier in that regard. And I think what you do is, get in your car if you don't live there, but go to Washington County and drive around, starting at the northern end and then driving kind of the southern end of the county. And what you'll see is a really fascinating pattern in which there actually has been a lot of development, particularly residential development, in the northern part of the county, in the suburbs surrounding Pittsburgh or nearest to Pittsburgh. But as you go to the southern part of the county from the town of Washington and on south toward Greene County, what you see is a situation that looks a lot more like Greene County, where you don't see the kind of development that we're talking about. And when I say development, I don't mean natural gas development. You see a lot of that. I'm talking about human development and social development and community development. And in that respect, Washington County, again, is a bit of a microcosm because, for the last decade, Pittsburgh as a city has done reasonably well in terms of jobs and population. It hasn't been growing immensely, but it's held its own. And it's also added some really important industries and helped and frankly transitioned in a really admirable way for a place that was once, so deeply invested in steel, coal, and other kind of classic blue collar industries. And to the degree that Washington County functions as a bedroom community for Pittsburgh, it's done well. But to the degree that Washington County functions as an independent entity and a source for natural gas growth, it actually, in that regard, looks pretty much like the rest of the natural gas counties.
Thanks, Sean. While we have you, I think I'll skip down to Paul's second question because it's relevant to what you've been talking about. So far, many of the figures you've been presenting have been in the aggregate, but were there any counties, like for example, Greene County, where there is a lot of drilling that outperformed the averages that you saw in either the fracking counties or comparing the fracking counties to the control counties?
Sure. I mean, Greene County is interesting because it has not significantly outperformed the other counties. In the case of Greene County, going back to, again, our report from a year ago where we looked at job performance over the decade, there was no job growth in Greene County through 2019. And then, of course, we know that the wheels started coming off the economy in 2020. And so at this point, Greene has experienced job losses and it has significantly experienced population losses. And I'd also like to add on another element referred to by Amanda in her comments, because she emphasized, for instance, that one of the factors that is most determinative of economic prosperity and the ability to grow is the school system. And if you haven't, Paul, I strongly suggest you put in a call to Mike Belding, who's the chair of the commission in Greene County, and talk to him about the challenges that county is facing with the 5 school systems that are there, the problems of depopulation, the economic and financial challenges that are faced, to the point that the county is having to raise property taxes to a degree that make it less competitive with surrounding counties in attracting residential development. In other words, and that has very specific impacts on the school systems. And so at a time when, as Amanda points out, it's imperative that counties like Greene County be able to offer excellent education and other amenities like that, it is precisely that ability that is being undermined by the population loss and by the job loss that, frankly, in large part is being driven by the gas industry.
Great. Thank you, Sean. The next question is for Amanda, again from Kathy Kowalski. What kinds of infrastructure development funded by recent federal legislation could particularly help some of the rural counties in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and elsewhere when it comes to improving quality of life and attracting and retaining jobs? And how are legacy issues from coal mining and natural gas drilling likely to affect quality of life and the potential for job growth and retention?
That's a great question. So one thing we see repeatedly in the research is what we call a natural resource curse. And so what the natural resource curse is do you have these industries, and if you are extracting natural resources, despite the boom, despite the job growth, despite the money you can get from extracting these natural resources, what tends to happen, and this is across countries, this is across counties, across states, is you tend to see eventually they underperform everybody else. They do worse. So this is why I kind of call it a curse. And a lot of what we found with this curse is what those mechanisms are, is you're taking kind of this capital out of the county and it never gets it back, right? So how do we combat that? So you need to basically invest in capital sources for those counties. So that could be natural resources. So that means repairing the damage done by these extractive industries. That could mean building up other places like your forests, your hiking trails, your rivers, cleaning up water sources. It could also mean investing in other sources of capital, which could be human capital. So what Sean just mentioned, investing in that school system. So now you're investing in another capital source to sort of build up the capital in these counties. So what happens is these drilling industries are kind of taking the capital down. We need to find ways to build the capital up. So human capital could be K-12 education. It could be childcare. And so when we think about investments in these counties, it could be investments in schooling, in childcare, in food stores, in kind of the basic things people need to live. But it also could mean directing resources to those local areas so those local areas can decide what they need most. Maybe what they need most is a community center, an art center. Maybe it's, investments in their library. Maybe it's, whatever unique thing is to their county. So you also need some of these federal funds to be decided not at the federal level, but also to be directed more towards that local level where they can decide, here's what our county really needs. Maybe it's a pool, whatever it is. To really invest in these counties, making them a nice place to live.
Thank you. The next question I'll pose, and feel free anyone to jump in and respond, is how can local officials influence the legislature for more investment in communities, especially communities that have been harmed by extractive industries?
Oh, well, I'll start to take a run at that one. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, we're at kind of a pregnant moment with the passage most recently of the Inflation Reduction Act. But prior to that, the Infrastructure Act, which goes back a few months ago. And those measures are providing a lot of funds to the states. And I should also add that assuming that Pennsylvania successfully implements its participation in the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, that will be another source of funds which can be used to do things like energy efficiency upgrades in particular, distributed generation, education. And one of the most effective things that local community leaders can do is, yes, put pressure on representatives to please make sure that those funds are used specifically for those purposes that I just rattled off, and not to fund more tax breaks, more forms of regulatory relief, more subsidies for natural gas expansion. And that's a critical thing to do, because I know in Pennsylvania in particular, there has been discussion, for instance, of using some of the revenue coming out of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative membership to help propel the development of a hydrogen hub, which would literally be a missed opportunity and a perpetuation of what we've seen so far, and probably with pretty much the same outcomes. So that is an area in which I think county commissioners, mayors, and folks at the local level can play a really critical role by going to state legislators, taking the figures that we've shown in this report and in previous reports, and just say, look, the numbers don't lie. The industry's record, you are what your record says you are. We're getting a bad deal. Please do not pour more good money after bad, because that's not only something that will not result in good outcomes, the squandering of resources on efforts like this also deprives us of the opportunity of pursuing the kinds of opportunities that Amanda has described.
Great. I also just wanted to, I see that Patty DeMarco put another comment in the Q&A, which is related to matching requirements that come with a lot of the federal funds. And, you know, I do think, at least in the case of the infrastructure bill, the IIJA, that there are significant categories of funding for which there's actually no matching requirement. And that's one of the pieces of research that we've been doing kind of on the side, is trying to identify where those opportunities might be. And I think my hope anyway is that for some of the programs, particularly in economically distressed communities and communities with a history of impacts from energy industries, that there's some latitude in being able to access some of these programs without having to supply that kind of significant matching requirement, which, as you note, is a major hurdle for a lot of communities that could most benefit. Well, we do have a few more minutes. If there are any other questions, please feel free to use the chat or the Q&A. Again, we will be making this recording available, so stay tuned for an email from Ben Hunkler in follow-up. Sean and Amanda, I'm sure, would also be happy for any follow-up conversations if you'd like to talk with them individually. And again, thank you all so much for joining us here this morning. Sean, thank you for your excellent research. And Amanda, thank you so much for your support and for the great work that you're doing through the University of Akron and with your colleagues.
Thank you.